Hello and welcome to the first webinar in our how-to series brought to you by Strengthening the Heartland. We're really excited that you could join us today, and we're looking forward to a really excellent presentation. Before we get started and I introduce our presenter for the day, I have a couple just reminders, logistical things for those of you who are new or are returning. First of all, we're happy to take questions that you might have for the presenter. Anytime during the presentation, you can enter those questions into the chat box, and then we'll wait till the end of the presentation and I'll relay those to our speaker, but please feel free to write them in at any time. Also, you'll see a link for the handout for today's presentation, and then you'll also be receiving a link to do a really brief survey for us. We really value your feedback and especially any kind of suggestions that you might have for upcoming webinars. So feel free to enter those into the survey link. If you are watching via recording, you can also access that survey link wherever you found this video. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenter for today. This is Dr. Jillian Blueford. She is a clinical assistant professor coming to us from the University of Denver. So welcome, Jillian.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who is taking the time to join this webinar and learn a little bit more about grief and how do we talk to youth about grief and how we best support them. So a little bit about me. Um, I am a clinical assistant professor at the University of Denver for the school counseling program. My first professional clinical experience was actually at a hospice bereavement center in Florida. Did not know what I was doing when I first started, and really learned a great deal about grief from those who were patients of that hospice and for the families before and after the death, and really what they were going through. And then also, as me, I experienced a lot of grief as a kid. Had some significant losses in my life that definitely changed the trajectory of my professional experiences and my research, and what I really wanted to learn about grief through the lens of youth. And then also, I just have a passion about learning more about grief. It is not something that we talk about often in this society, and it's not something that we are entirely comfortable with, although we know that it is inevitable. And so I really want to figure out how can we educate larger communities about grief? How can we make sure that everyone feels supported through such a tough loss? And how can we best prepare for future losses that we may experience? So my hopes for a little bit before I get to my hopes for this session, the agenda, I just want to talk about what grief is and what it isn't and what it may look like, in every different person. What does grief look like, particularly for youth, and how that may differ from adults? When does grief become a problem? Right, because grief is typically a natural reaction and response to a loss, but there can be times where we will need to intervene more than others. And what can we do as helping professionals to just support grieving youth now and years down the road? So my hopes for you all in this session is that you feel more comfortable talking about grief with everyone in your life. Like I mentioned before, we typically cringe or turn the other way when we hear about death, when we hear about grief, especially in youth. We want to protect their innocence as much as we can, and it hurts our heart when we see that youth are hurting. And so, we want to jump in and we want to fix it and we want to make them feel better. But unfortunately, this is an experience that, one, may not go away, and I'll talk about that later on in the presentation, and two, that we can't just say, here, do this, and then you won't have any more grief for the rest of your life. I wish it was that easy, but it's definitely a complicated and complex experience. I hope that you all feel more equipped to support children who are grieving, youth that are grieving, and notice it in youth. A lot of times we'll see it as something else and we'll start to fix the problem or the behavioral problem or the academic issue, but really it's the grief. And if we can hone in on that and talk to youth about how to cope with losses, could that change the outcomes that we're seeing, that we're hoping that they will change anyways? And then also, I hope that you all take away practical but meaningful strategies and tools that you can share with others. I want this to be a conversation that we're able to have with anyone. It's not a matter of if, but when you encounter youth that are grieving. And so we all want to be prepared to have those meaningful conversations and implement some strategies that can really help. All right, so before we kind of get going, I wanted to provide some grounding definitions. A lot of times we'll hear grief, we'll hear bereavement, we'll hear loss, we'll hear mourning even as interchangeable terms. And they are and they aren't. And so I want to make sure that we understand kind of some differences between those terms, starting with loss. So any experience across the lifespan that demands the surrender of something personally significant and or familiar. And so this can include a wide variety of things. It does not have to be death related, although that's the focus of this presentation. It can be, relationship ending, financial stability or instability, health changes, parents are divorcing, changing schools, a lot of things, a lot of losses that youth can experience that could affect their development, their behavior, their coping skills. And so really it's an umbrella for a lot of things. Bereavement is the state of having a loss of a loved one through death. So that kind of hones it a little bit more of just loss in general, but just focusing on losing an individual as a death-related cause. And then grief is the reaction to loss. So it can include all the reactions that we have, not just emotional, but physically, how we think, spiritually, psychologically, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Just a couple of things, and as I'm sure every attendee that's listening right now has experienced a loss, whether it's death related or not. And so I encourage you to reflect on that a little bit as you're learning throughout this webinar and see what connects from you, what you have experienced, what you haven't. But I'm sure, and just in my experience working with kiddos or with adults, that when you are grieving, you don't feel like it's normal. You feel like you are the odd one out. That no one understands what you're going through. There might not be anyone else that's also experienced this type of loss. Even if we know rationally that's not true, and even if youth know that rationally that's not true, it doesn't feel normal to be in the grieving process. And we really try to do everything we can to not be in the grieving process. So just know that that is also the case for youth as well. And as far as experiencing loss, it is never just, even if it's death related, it's never just one single event. There are always multiple losses that are experienced, whether it's the primary loss is the death, but then as a result of that, youth have to move schools or change friends or change neighborhoods, and a lot of other secondary losses that also impact them. It occurs in the present, so at that moment, and then will continue to be a loss for them for the rest of their life. Every person will respond uniquely to the type of loss they've encountered, and that really makes it even more of a challenge for helping professionals, because we want to know, is this an appropriate way for youth to be grieving? Is this a problem? Do I need to just, let time do its thing? And so it can make it challenging when everyone will respond to grief in a different way, and there's no right or wrong way, more of healthy, maybe unhealthy ways to cope with loss. Loss can occur prior to the physical separation. And so when I say this, I think of anticipatory grief. So youth that know that an individual is dying because of a terminal illness, and they're experiencing that grief prior to the person dying themselves, or if they have a loved one who has dementia, and while physically they're still there, their decline is becoming apparent, the relationship is changing, and the youth is preparing for that person to no longer be there physically. And so that's a grieving process in itself that can occur way before, again, that person has died. Developmental capacities influence the loss experience, and we'll get more into about younger youth compared to adolescents, compared to teens, and how they can conceptualize death and the finite aspect of that experience. And then also there's tons of culture and customs and norms and society influences that definitely contribute to how youth grieve. They learn how to grieve by looking at family members, they're looking at adults and other ones to see how they're reacting, how they're expressing their grief or not expressing their grief. And that is all tied to our culture and what we believe in. Is tied to religion and what we believe in and what happens after we die. And all of that is happening at the same time, even if the youth do not recognize that, like, these are a lot of systemic influences are causing them to grieve and think about loss the way that they are. But as professionals, we can start to notice some patterns, point out some things that this is why, we grieve this way, or this is why we have certain rituals that we do that may be completely different than other countries and other cultures. Experiencing grief is, like I mentioned before, is complex, and it does not just include, feeling sad or upset that that person is no longer here. That's definitely a key part of it, our emotions, but also how the youth are thinking about this and their worldview. We are typically taught and reminded that, a lot of people die when they get to old age, and most of the time, don't worry, you will die in your sleep, right? But we know that's not the case for a lot of people, right? And unfortunately for youth as well. So when youth experience the death of someone their age, they are looking at, okay, this is, am I going to die soon? Are my loved ones going to die soon? How unsafe is my world? Because I thought that I didn't have to worry about this for a really long time, and now it is coming up sooner than they would hope for. Behaviorally, you'll see that the most in youth, whether it's problematic behaviors, which we'll get into, or the opposite, where youth are overachieving and making sure that they're getting straight A's in everything and have all the friends and try out and make every sports team because they have to um, maintain this perfect image that I'm okay and I'm not grieving, I'm not doing poorly, or that I have to maintain this persona to make my loved one who died proud, right? So it can go on both ends of the spectrum. Psychologically and spiritually, like I said, a lot of times death comes up for youth and coincides with conversations about religion and what happens after we die, what happens to our spirits, our souls, our physical bodies afterwards. That plays a lot of role into how long we think we need to grieve. What's the appropriate way to grieve? Who do we talk to about our grief, and who do we not talk about it with? That are, again, youth might not be able to identify, like, yes, this is why I chose not to share about my grief, but they are norms that are being instilled in them all throughout their youth and all throughout their development. And then also physiological. So, prolonged stress and chronic stress, it manifests itself in many ways, including physically. So that can include a lot of headaches, stomach aches, getting sick more often, that if we're not paying attention to, we will miss that that might be a part of the grief. And that's just the way that a youth is expressing their grief, is by, physical ailments or not being able to, like I said, have a strong immune system or be able to maintain like a healthy body. So to continue with some of the common grief symptoms, this is definitely not a one list and this is it. There are so many ways, like I mentioned before, for us to grieve and for youth to grieve, but these are some common symptoms. So I'll start with emotional. A lot of these emotions are common and expected, including sadness and anger and guilt and anxiety about, do I need to worry about my loved ones, my other loved ones dying? Do I need to worry about myself dying or my friends? Loneliness, feeling fatigue. And then towards the end, you'll see relief. And I want to make sure that I am clear with, not everyone who is grieving the death of someone has to be sad, right? And that's our society that tells us you need to be sad, you need to be crying, you need to be yearning for this person to come back. But I have been reminded in my experience working with kids, especially when the person who has died has been abusive towards them or neglectful, or they didn't have a great relationship, that sometimes relief can be part of that as well. And not so much of, man, I'm glad that this, parental figure or this loved one is gone, but man, I am glad that I am no longer going to be hurt by this person. And that's a challenge because, again, our society tells us that you need to be sad. You need to want that person to come back. And when youth want to share with other friends or other peers, they're like, I'm kind of okay that they're not here. That might not be received well by others, and that might tell that youth that, okay, I need to keep those feelings to myself, and that I can't share that I am okay that this person is no longer here. Or if that person was battling a terminal illness and now I'm okay because I believe that they're not hurting anymore, or I know that at least they're not physically sick anymore, and that brings comfort and relief to me. Again, it's normal, and it's definitely a natural response for certain cases, but just be willing to accept all the emotions that come when youth are grieving, and not just the ones that are more common or more typical. Back to the physical symptoms, so hollowness in the stomach, tightness in chest, um, that lump in your throat that you have when you're thinking about that person, you're going through grief, that again youth might attribute to other problems that might just be grief and might just need to be named. Lack of energy, increased visits to the school nurse or to the doctor that seem, we can't explain where this is coming from. That might be a red flag to you. They're like, oh, okay, maybe has to do with grief. And when did this start? And how often does this occur? To really say, maybe this is how you grieve. This is how your body is showing that, you're hurt or upset, or dealing with this loss in any particular way. So just things that, oversensitivity to noise, weakened immune system, things to notice when you're meeting with and working with youth, to also check in about physically how are they doing with their grief. Because grief is exhausting, and grief will take up all of the time and all of our energy. And so we want to remind youth of that as well, that it's okay to not always be at 100%, and, have lack of energy and feel tired all the time when you're grieving. That is appropriate and normal. And then behaviorally, so changes in sleep patterns, appetite, absent-minded at times, not being able to focus in class or on their homework. It might increase to more school absences or tardiness, and that also can tie back to their physical being. So if they're not feeling well, then they're not going to school, then they can fall behind in school. Um, Things like that. They all kind of connect in a way. And like I said, the other end of it too, increase in high achievement. And so I worked with plenty of kids that, their parents were like, I think this person is fine. I think my child is fine because their grades are remaining the same. They're still talking to their friends. They're doing way more that I would ever thought of before. And so I don't think that they're grieving. And we'll get more into why adults may overlook those students and those youth, because they seem to be doing well and they still deserve the same check-in and process and time to express their grief, just like the youth that maybe are displaying more problematic behaviors. Social withdrawal, crying. I put that in there as yes, it is normal to cry. I always tell youth it is normal, it's healthy, and it's a great way to express emotions. I also put that in there for professionals. And it reminds me of a time where I was working at a university, and a college student had died unexpectedly in a car accident. And our student affairs individuals has said, if you're talking to a student and you can tell that they're grieving and they're crying, your first response shouldn't be, hey, maybe you should go get help, right? We want to make sure that crying and is validated, is a normal response to losing someone that was important to you, and is a common symptom, right? And again, depending on gender norms and what we tell children, that, life is hard, but we got to just suck it up. That's not what you tell a grieving youth, right? That crying, that you got to move through the tears, uh, and it happens more than we think, and it happens unintentionally by adults that are in youth's life. And so just know that crying is normal, and remind youth that crying is normal and healthy, and needed at times. And also, if the person is not typically a crier and that's not how they choose to express their grief, that's also okay. We don't have to force that on them as well. Restless hyperactivity, so just busybodies, avoiding reminders of the deceased. So you bring it up, or important dates are coming by, and just not talking about it, not wanting even to acknowledge, not engaging in any conversations. Um, could be how that person is coping, right? And it could be how they're coping for that particular time. It may change over time. Or, like I said, on the other opposite end, hyper focus on reminders of the deceased. I see this a lot in younger youth that typically overshare information anyways, or more common to talk to strangers and say that their loved one has died, and maybe to divulge more information that um, their family will want them to, but can definitely focus on that loss quite a bit. And then also substance use. We all human beings, we try to find ways to cope with the stress that's going on in our life, the emotions that we don't want to feel. And like I said, there's no right or wrong way. There are some ways that are healthier than others, and so that is something to be on the lookout for, um, as youth are trying to find their way to cope with their loss and cope with their grief. Some might turn to substances as well. All right, so I get a question a lot about, when grief is a natural response and natural reaction, and it happens to everyone, but when does it become a problem and when does it become atypical grief? So the symptoms I mentioned before, um, in the last slide, are all common things you can expect with youth grieving. However, there does become a period of time when maybe their grief is becoming a little more complicated than just the natural grief process. And I always tell folks, look at the timing of the death, and when you're working with the youth, and how long they've been experiencing and expressing certain grief symptoms. So if I'm working with a youth that, just a month ago they experienced a loss, yeah, I'm going to still expect, you know, changes in sleeping patterns, maybe not eating a lot, not focusing well in school. It's just been a month, and so I'm expecting that, and that's not a red flag for me. However, if it's been 8, 9, 10, 11 months, and it's still, appetite is not there, having really a hard time sleeping, it's really trying to affect their academic performance, they're not hanging out with their friends anymore, they're isolating, then maybe it's getting more into they're having a tougher time and a complicated time processing their grief. And also the intensity of it. So again, a couple months or here and there of being absent-minded or having some physical symptoms is not a worrisome for me. But if it's every day and really bad sharp stomach pains or really bad headaches, then we might need to, long as it's not something else physically, we might need to explore the fact that it might be complicated grief. And then also I look at the manner of the death of the person who has died. And so individuals who die as a result of murder, of suicide, in the military, uh, it adds a level of complications to it. I always try to find out if the youth found the person who has died or was there, if they knew the person was dying, that also adds another layer to it. And how I understand, okay, maybe these symptoms for this long does continue to make sense, and maybe I do need to step in with other things if it's more of a traumatic loss, because a lot of times people they'll clump grief with crisis, they'll clump it with trauma, they'll clump it with depression, because a lot of the symptoms can be the same. And so I want to make sure that, uh, if we work with grieving youth, we're not automatically assuming that it is a traumatic experience or that it is a immediate crisis, right? Because again, I want us to make sure we're normalizing grief as a process, as a response to a loss, and therefore, it happens to everyone, and not every time it is a emergency, all hands on deck. But I want to make sure that you all recognize that when it is going on for long periods of time, when the student or the youth safety becomes in question, or introduction of using substances, things like that, then we take charge and we kind of address those concerns. But as long as it seems like a just a normal reaction to things, and a um, just time for the youth to process their loss, and this is how it's coming out for them, then you want to be there to support them and validate that as much as you can before trying to make it an issue, or make it as, you can no longer grieve because now becoming a problem. Um, so yeah. A couple things about grief. I want to debunk a few myths. So if there's nothing else that you take from this webinar, I want you to take the next two things I'm about to say. One, there are not stages of linear grief. And so when I talk to parents, talk to professionals, a lot of times I hear about the stages of grief developed by Kubler-Ross. And they say, this is what I kind of use, or I'm stuck at this particular stage. And I always remind folks that Kubler-Ross developed the stages of grief for folks who were dying themselves and not for individuals who were grieving the death of somebody else. I don't know where along the line we flipped that idea and started to use it for grieving the death of people after they have already died. But those are not the intentions of her development of that model. And so what it does now, when we kind of have that, I got to go through these stages and then I'll get to acceptance, we're pigeonholing our grief process, and we have to go through certain steps, and if we don't make it past the first stage, then we're not doing okay. Or if we see that youth are stuck in denial, then they're never going to make it to acceptance. I want to, again, kind of shatter that myth that we have to work in a particular way through grief, and we have to hit these certain benchmarks, and then magically we'll go to acceptance and we will totally be okay with grief and we'll get back to our normal life. That unfortunately does not happen. It is now a new normal for youth that they'll have to learn to adapt to and reconcile with. Not necessarily something they have to be cured from or recover from or get over with. I hear a lot of youth, I hear a lot of adults say, I just want to get over this loss. And as long as you continue to think about that person, as long as you continue to love that person, or consider that person significant in your life, then you will also be grieving the death of that person. They kind of work tangent with each other, and so it's hard to just get rid of grief, although that will solve a lot of problems. Also, grief is not time limited. We, again, Western society, we allow a couple months, a couple weeks, maybe a couple days, depending on where you're at, to grieve, attend ritual events, and then you need to come back and get back to it. And same with schools. Here's a couple of excused absences, and then you need to kind of get back into it and keep doing well in school. And that's not how grief works. It will go on, especially for youth. It will go on for the rest of their lives, right? And the younger they are, the older they get, and developmental stages they hit, the different ways grief will set in. And so we want to make sure that we're not displaying okay, well, just give it a few months and you'll be back to normal. It again does not work that way, and it's not. It goes on his own time, and so we want to make sure we're telling youth that it is okay that even 2-3 years after the person has died, you're still thinking about them. You still get upset and sad when holidays come around or the anniversary of the death comes around. That is okay, because there is no time limit for grief. There have been several scholars along the way that has looked at how people grieve and what's the best way to support children, adults, everyone who is grieving a loss. And so I won't cover all the models, but we really have come a long way from starting with Freud, who kind of had the idea that once someone dies, you need to get over that grief and move that energy that you would be for grieving that person into something else and somebody else. And if you can't, then something's wrong. And so thankfully we have moved past that mindset and have been open to you don't need to get over that person, you don't need to get over that loss, but rather now there's more constructivist theories and models that how can we make meaning of this loss, how can we work with youth to make meaning of it, to still continue their relationship with the person who has died, and even though it will look differently because they're not physically here, doesn't mean that we have to separate that relationship. We just have to decide, how do we want to continue that bond, and how do we want to process that loss in a way that makes sense and meaning for youth. All right, and I've had attachment is key. Like I mentioned before, you're going to want to really understand the relationship that youth had with that person prior to death, and not assume that it was a warm, loving, caring relationship and now they're distraught and devastated that that person is no longer here. really get an idea of what that relationship was. And even if it was a warm, loving relationship, we all know that people aren't perfect, and no relationship is perfect. And so, honoring that and still allowing the youth to memorialize and reflect on the good and maybe not the great parts of that relationship with that person. All right. So, developmental considerations. Typically, we have found that children 7 years and older can begin to understand death as a final experience. Um, Children younger than that have a hard time grasping that, you know, the person who died today will also be dead, 4 days from now. It's just a harder concept for them to understand. But also, the idea is that, man, my world is unsafe. I lost one parent, I might lose the other. I might lose my siblings. People around me die. That is, it's tough when so many youth are experiencing losses and they're experiencing and learning that unfortunate fact at an early age. But it is something that they grasp and learn when they experience loss. And so therefore, language adjustment may be needed for us. So, when I talk to another adult and I say, yeah, so and so passed away, that adult understands that I mean that person has died. However, for kids, especially the ones that are younger than 7, might not get these euphemisms that we use to describe death. And while using the word dead or died sounds cold and it sounds, blunt and to the point, it helps with youth that developmentally they need to know concrete words and need to know exactly what you mean. And I always think about a case where when I was at the hospice, and a young kid had lost his dad, and mom had told him that, dad went to God's house. And that was kind of how she phrased it. Um, but a lot of people also refer to going to church or place of worship as God's house. And so a few weeks later, they went to church, and the kiddo started to look around for his dad because he's mom said he went to God's house, and now we're in God's house. And then it hit the mom again, like I have to explain to him again, like what I really meant, and it brought another wave of pain, of hurt, of difficulty explaining to your son that your dad is dead and not just um, in at church. And so I encourage you all to, even when the youth are saying euphemisms, when you're reflecting back to them, you're using the words, oh, so your grandfather died or your loved one is dead, because you want to make sure, again, for the younger ones, that they get it concretely, and not instilling false hope that that person is not actually dead, right? Because a lot of times adults will say, oh, we lost someone. Well, kids lose shoes all the time. They lose toys, they lose things, and they find them. And so is that going to be the same case for their loved one? And again, it makes it more uncomfortable for the adults to then have to re-explain what they mean, rather than if we just use a direct language the first time around. Psychosocial, so developmental tasks, and what roles do the youth have in the family unit already, and what roles may they have to take on or perceive they have to take on now that if they have a loved one that dies. So I see this a lot with youth who have a parent who dies, that typically, you know, they're the cook, or they take out the trash, or they're the ones responsible for cleaning the rooms, and now, depending on the age of the youth, feel like I need to take on these tasks. Like I need to step in and either help, or maybe adults have told them, dad has died, now you're the man of the house, right? And you need to step up. Right? And those are tough things for youth to hear, because to take on adult responsibilities at a young age is tough. And those are things that, again, adults unintentionally might be sharing to youth that you might have to process, and really make sure that they are grieving, and to get a better insight into what they think their roles are now in the family, within themselves, with their friends, with school, now that they've experienced this loss. Inclusion in death-related and grief-related activities. A lot of times I have parents that talk to me that loved one has died and they don't want to bring the kid to the wake, to the funeral, to any memorial services. And we really have to talk about the purpose of rituals and how it helps, one, initiate kind of that grieving process, and especially for youth, can really help with the concrete of death and the finite experience of death. When they either if they see the person or just attend the rituals, that okay, maybe now I understand what they mean when they say this person has died. Also attending rituals, they'll see the different reactions that people are having, so they might feel validated to say, oh, it is okay to cry because I see my loved ones crying. Or it's okay to laugh when we share stories about this person because I think about funny memories and I want to laugh. And so it's a nice way to expose youth uh, to the reactions that people have at different rituals, to grief, to loss in general, and to get them to be be surrounded by people that they can then further talk to, because they know that, hey, you were crying and I was crying as well. Could I confide in you when I get upset again that this person is gone? So I always recommend to professionals to educate parents and caregivers and families on this, because I get why there's hesitation. We don't want to scar children. We don't want to, again, hurt them any more than they may already be by this loss. But giving youth the opportunity to attend these rituals has will help them tremendously along the grieving process. Uh, the youth that I've I've worked with, the ones that haven't been allowed to attend any type of rituals or activities or memorial services, have always regretted and still regret it. And it could have been years after their loss that they were not given the opportunity to. And I've never worked with a youth that said, I was given the opportunity to go and I went and I absolutely regret it. Right? Never say never, but giving youth the option, and if they decide they don't want to, that's fine. But it is important to include them in that process. And then also I wanted to touch on the re-grief phenomenon. So as kiddos get older, they'll grow developmentally, and so their ability to conceptualize the grief will change. Right? So if someone loses a loved one at 8, when they hit 12, 15, and they understand more about death and loss and what that means for them, they can go through the grieving process again, right? So you might see the same symptoms that family members saw at 8 start to reappear, because now their brain is bigger, they understand more, and that might affect how they really see the gravity of their loss. And same with they get older. So we see a lot of this times when youth, they graduate high school and they, usually memories and moments where you have those loved ones with you, and they can go through that cycle again because that person is not there, or getting their driver's license, or attending prom, or even going from middle school to high school. A lot of those developmental cycles and milestones that youth hit, they can then reflect on, oh man, I don't have this person here that all my other friends have, their mom with them when they go pick out homecoming and prom dresses, and I don't. And so again, the similar symptoms that they had before can appear, because it can almost seem like they're going through the grieving cycle again, the grieving process again. And then disenfranchised grief. Kenneth Doka actually coined this term as anyone who is grieving um, a, a type of loss or a person that is often either stigmatized in society, or we don't recognize as grievers. So he included children as this, because a lot of times, I hear adults say, well, they're too young to understand, or they don't really know what's fully going on. And so I don't think that they're grieving to the same level as the adults. And I always have to educate them that children grieve all the time. It may not look like what we are doing, but they are grieving. Even if they are, as young as 3 and 4, and they might not fully understand anything that's happening, you know, kids pick up on things, right? And they notice how we're reacting to stuff. They definitely notice if a person who was in their daily life is no longer there, and they grieve, right? And again, it just will look different. Other examples of this is, if someone is grieving the death of someone by suicide, that is still a stigma in our society, and so that might hold back what that person expresses or communicates to other people in need of support, because they don't want others to look at them differently because they're grieving a person who completed suicide. So just keep in mind that there's a lot of work to do to convince people that children grieve, and that they need the same support that we do as adults. Cultural considerations, like I mentioned before, it shapes how we grieve, it shapes how we mourn, it shapes how we understand loss. There is access to supports varies across cultures. Again, so if typical cultures are not as expressive as their grief, then children, youth internalize that, and they won't be as expressive of their grief. And so you want to make sure that you understand your youth's culture and what they've been taught and what they know, and to look at how their family is grieving. Right, a lot of times family members want to support children and youth, but they're grieving that same loss as them, and so they're just trying themselves to keep it together, to hold it together, and to get through the day. Um, Also remember that within group differences exist. So just because you have an idea of how a particular culture or religion may grieve, may mourn, doesn't mean that everyone who identifies with that will do the grieve in the same way. So you still want to see what unique aspects of grief involves or is attributed to that youth. It's grief is influenced by culture, and then also I added the emergence of social media has changed how we grieve and how quickly youth learn about death, and it's everywhere. So I untimely enough, the death of Kobe Bryant, I think about youth a lot, and how quickly that news spread, how, when it was all over my social media. So I can imagine for youth that, whether they knew him, whether they loved basketball or not, learned about this. And then they also learned that children died, right? So again, it's like, oh man, like this was an accident. This was, this could have been anyone. And there were teenagers who died, right? And so does that mean that I could potentially die as a teenager? And am I safe? Am I secure? Could anything happen to me? Because it wasn't, again, this older folks that who passed away, peacefully. It was a pretty tragic accident. And so it's social media definitely, uh, even if they don't experience loss for the first time, they witness loss, and they witness other people grieving and how they grieve. So what can we do to support? Basics, humility is key. Like I said, I'm sure that everyone who's attending has experienced a loss and has gone through grief in a variety of ways. And we want to be humble enough to learn how grieving looks through the eyes of youth and to meet them where they are in that process. So I always encourage folks to listen and normalize the youth experiences, no matter how outrageous they may seem. Again, like I mentioned before, we always think that we're the odd ones when we're grieving, and we're not doing okay. And really, it's just you're doing just fine. You're grieving, and so I don't expect anything else besides what you're doing. Um, Once be open and ready for those conversations when and if they happen, right? We want to make sure that youth kind of have control in how they discuss their grief and how they process it. Nothing reminds us more that we are out of control than when we learn of someone who has died, right? That's a quick reminder to us that, man, life is short, and I don't have as much control as I would like. And so we want to give as much autonomy and control when we're working with youth who are grieving. And so processing that, encouraging them to make meaning of their experiences that's unique to their style of grief, their expression of grief, their culture, and who they are as a person. Be prepared for the resurgence of grief. Again, around birthdays, around anniversaries, and sometimes the youth might not even be able to recognize, like, oh yeah, I didn't even know that the anniversary was coming up or this person's birthday was coming up. But I noticed that I was acting different, right? I noticed that I got more sharp with people, or my appetite went away suddenly and I had no idea. And then you talk about dates that are coming up, and it might click, like, oh yeah, might be why my body is reacting this way. Also, I encourage folks not to make any promises. Again, working with youth, we want to support them, we want to empower them. And I've had tons of grieving youth ask me, will I die? Like, can you promise me that I won't experience this again, that I won't lose anyone again? And I can't make any promises, right? And we want to encourage families and parents and caregivers to also not make any promises that we can't keep, and we can't keep a promise like this for youth. Be creative in interventions. I'm going to go through some different strategies and tools that you can use. Connect to your community resources. If there's grief camps in the area, if there's centers for grieving children in the area that you can rely on and refer to as just a resource is great. And then considering your setting, psychoeducation, right? And that might be for the parents, for the caregivers, for if you're working with teachers or other professionals, just normalizing death and normalizing grief, and helping adults remember that children are grieving too. We don't want to overlook them in this process. All right, so some potential activities. Um, Let me see. Yep. So we have our. I'm gonna explain some of these. I also have a couple of websites that you'll see in this PowerPoint that will explain all of these activities in details. They can be adapted to any age, and or groups. So I know a lot of folks that also run grief groups with youth, and so this can be adapted as well. And so some of these are just what they are, what they sound like, and what you read. Grief timeline. And so I often will have kiddos kind of map out all the losses that they have experienced. And, mostly pets are the first loss that I hear of youth experiencing, but then also include, any type of losses, people as well. And we talk about, what were our experiences, what were our emotions, our thoughts, what did we notice the other adults and other people in our lives doing, to try to see, here are some patterns, here are, the wide variety of losses. What good supports did you have in those experiences? What maybe not some good supports or not good things that were said to you did you have during that grieving process? Memory box jar. A lot of folks, if kiddos are ready to talk about their loved one who had died, I encourage them to bring in pictures, to bring in things that remind them of that person. And I like the idea of keeping it in a box, in a jar, because then if the grief becomes too overwhelming, they can put it aside. And if they want to spend time thinking about that person, they can bring it out in their room. It doesn't have to be around people. They can decorate it all that they want, and it can really just be their thing to have. Letters to the deceased. So if the youth didn't feel like they got the chance to say goodbye, or if it was sudden or they weren't with the person, um, love writing letters about what do you wish you could have said, what do you wish the person would know about you now. And a lot of that is just cathartic release for youth. Again, they can keep them, they can rip them up. It is for them. Scrapbooking as well. Music, I found a really good help with either the youth talking about music that they shared with the person who died, or that reminds them of the person who died. And we'll bring it up and we'll listen to it and we'll look at the lyrics, and we will really see what that song means for them, right? Grief creature and grief mass. So I for the grief creature, I try to name the grief. So let's talk about this grief monster. Let's talk about this thing that keeps popping up out of nowhere, that keeps getting you upset and maybe in trouble at school or keeps you away from your friends. And how can we talk to this monster about what's really going on and what we need to make sure that if the grief creature or monster wants to stay, it needs to have some norms. It needs to learn how to make sure that you're still being a productive and content and fulfilled person, right? And so sometimes, especially for the younger ones, we want to name it as this is not so great thing, and sometimes ugly monster that impedes in our life and we don't want it. And how can we learn to make friends with it, because we know that it might not go away. Grief mass. I often talk to youth about what's the face that we feel like we have to show to everyone, that to show that we're okay and we're doing fine, and our kind of our protective factor. And then what's the side of the inside of our face of how we're really feeling, what's really going on for us, and what do we really need help with that we aren't sharing with people. and how often, even with adults, we put on a brave face, and then, when we're by ourselves, then we let our emotions show. And so that's the same for youth. Candle lighting, that can also be for youth that I've worked with that weren't able to attend any like ritual activities. Sometimes candle lighting and decorating candles and can be helpful if that is appropriate for their culture, for their household. Obviously, we can also do fake candles. We don't want to give access to fire to all youth, but just a time to reflect and to sit and talk about that person. And sometimes candles can kind of set that atmosphere. Balloon release is a nice way, and a lot of students have written letters, especially if they practice under the religious affiliations that their person is in heaven. Then that can be an appropriate tool, appropriate strategy. Um, I know it's not the most environmentally friendly activity, and so I've also found biodegradable boxes that students can and youth can write letters and put things in that we then bury, and then is more environmentally friendly. Books, I also have a list of some books that are available, are really helpful for youth that either they're too young to verbalize their grief, or it's just helpful to read about grief and loss through a book character. And then we can kind of tie it back into how is this working for you. Spirit sticks, a nice way to just have fun and be creative and decorate and still memorialize that person. Beaded bracelets, poetry, things like that as well. So here are some resources. All of these places, again, will have all these activities that I mentioned in fuller detail, and just about how to talk about youth and during the holidays, how to talk about parents and caregivers, a lot of good resources and research through these associations and organizations. And then also some books. The first one is for professionals. Karen Humphrey wrote a great book about different strategies for adults, for youth, all in between. And then the rest of the books are more for youth. And again, a great way to have some visuals to help kiddos verbalize their grief. And it doesn't always have to be for young kiddos. I also put Harry Potter series, and it doesn't have to be a book where death is like the main focus of the book. But like in Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia, those books that have loss tied into the plot can be also a great way for older kids to enjoy reading books, or can read those books to associate maybe some of the loss and grief of those characters with their own. So that is all that I have, and so I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Jillian. That was really great. I was taking a lot of notes, so you might have seen me writing down here.
Yeah.
We have one question to start, and then if there are others, please feel free to add those to the box. First question is, do you see a difference in the reaction to grief in communities that maybe have high trauma, high death mortality, just in general as a community?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do. So, I also want to recommend, or I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of youth that live in communities where death and grief is a common thing. And depending on just their community, or you know situations where family members and loved ones have died early in their life, it definitely does. I do see a difference, as it's less of a shock and more of like, is this a normal life for me? This is the norm for me to always be in this chronic stress, this prolonged grief that occurs. And it definitely changes, from that, compared to a youth that this is the first loss they've ever experienced and might not experience a loss to this gravity for many years. I definitely do notice a difference, and I try to still acknowledge it and validate it as if it was just their first grief, right? Because a lot of times youth, again, it's like, oh well, this is the norm, this is what I expect, and I don't want them to minimize it, right? I don't want it to be oh well, this is part of life, because you know living in communities where there's tons of violence and danger all the time is not is not the norm, and shouldn't be the norm for youth, or really anyone, in that for that matter. And so yeah, I do notice a maybe a harder time to, how do I really process, how do I really come to terms with this when it may happen again pretty soon, and what does that really say about my safety net and my life and livelihood.
Yeah, for sure. That's an excellent question. Um, let's see, there was a question about whether or not people would be able to access the recording and the handouts, and so I guess I can answer that. We will make this recording available to you. If you're registered, you'll get a follow-up email where you can access that recording, but you'll also be able to find it on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and then just search for Strengthening the Heartland, you'll find all of our webinars in the series, and this one will be uploaded shortly. It takes us a little bit of time to get the transcript done, but then we will post it. So people wanted to rewatch and take more notes. So I think that's a great idea.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, Another question here. Do you see it as easier for youth to process grief if their culture or community has been known to be more accepting and more positive about the death and grieving process?
Hmm. Yeah, it helps. Yeah, absolutely. If the community, if the family is open to talking about grief, again, going along the pace of when the youth wants to, and if they want to talk about it, uh, and are usually more receptive to when we talk about rituals, and especially if we know the death is going to happen, and preparing and planning and having those conversations. Yeah, it helps for communities and cultures and families I worked with, where either talking to mental health professionals is not widely accepted, or just talking about death is not widely accepted. I first start with, usually they bring in, or usually refer to the youth because there is some behavioral issue, and they've noticed a change or something's going on at school, and they want that behavior fixed and changed to more positive behavior. And I tell them that, often if we work on the grief, if we even just open up conversations about that, and that can just start with me and the youth, and then if we need to bring in other people, we will, then you might notice a change in the behavior. And so I try to get on the same page of, like, yes, we want to change the current presenting concerns and behaviors, but we're going to take a step back a little bit, especially if this is a new change or something has shifted since the loss, and we can tie it back to maybe this is their grieving process. And also, I just spend time trying to provide the most education I can about grief and how it does happen in youth, and this is what it can look like, and checking with how are they grieving and how are they processing it, to get a better idea of if they're having conversations at home about this or not.
A couple more here. Great questions. When it comes to a death by suicide, maybe a peer has died by suicide, how do you help them channel their grief in a more healthy way, in a way that maybe avoids um, negative decision making or leads to other suicide attempts?
Yeah, and that's tough, because a lot of times will I've heard of schools that, a student has died by suicide, and the school's kind of response is like, we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to encourage other students to potentially attempt suicide. And it's tough, because we can't, like, just putting the like, just talking about suicide doesn't put that thought into someone's mind. It's like, yep, now I was never thinking about it, but now that you mention it, I'm thinking about it. Like, if there are ripple effects, it's because other students were also considering it. um, and so I think when I work with youth that have had, especially peers, die by suicide, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of anger, a lot of, um, why didn't I notice anything? Why didn't this person say anything to me? I thought we were friends. That I really try to work with them on reconciling that, and being okay that there might be some questions that will always go unanswered. And then there's also the youth that, if they were also thinking about suicide, they're like, I'm even more scared, because now I know that someone my age who also was thinking about this, who they might not even have known, went through with this, and I really don't want to go through with it. And so that's when, if that's the type of youth that I'm working with, I then focus on safety planning and how do we make sure we get resources in place that will help you not go through with any plans or any, or have your ideations turn into plans and potential attempts. And so it's a lot. It's and I see both types of youth exist in those type of capacities, and so you want to explain and talk about suicide and talk about that it is such a fluid thing, and it's such a fluid, like the thoughts and the ideations about it are they're always changing. And so it's impossible to, even if you knew that at one time someone was thinking about it, to know that, yep, they're thinking about it and they're going to go through with it, and I have that power to intervene. And I try to normalize that with youth, that it's a lot of woulda, coulda, shouldas, and we do that a lot to ourselves, especially in this situation, because that's all we have left to do, is think about what we could have done differently, and if we would have intervened early. And then for the youth that have also been thinking about that and are nervous about that, I do validate that, like, you've been thinking about this, you're nervous about it, you don't want to go through with it, so what can we do to make sure that you don't? And what supports do you need, and who do we need to involve in those conversations? Because sometimes it's a matter of, I've never told anyone that I've been thinking about this, and now I'm even more scared because one of my peers went through with it.
One more question here. As a school counselor, what's the best way to know if a young person is ready to talk about their loss?
Mm-hmm. I mean, beyond just like asking them and giving them the opportunity to say yes or no, I think that especially when I've met with youth in schools, I have brought, like, hey, do you know why you're meeting with me? And a lot of them will know, like, we often meet soon after that person has died, and they'll bring that up, and I'll leave the floor and the space to them, that if this is something that you want to talk about, that you're ready to share, then I'm here. If you want to talk about the other secondary losses that have occurred since this person has died, because that's more pressing and on your mind, we'll talk about that. It's really giving them the option to talk about it, and sometimes we're talking about it through activities, right? So it's rarely a, like, sit down, tell me how you're feeling about that, because that's a very loaded question that not a lot of people can just say, this is how I'm here, this is how I'm doing. So that's where I incorporate a lot of the creative interventions to do as we process it, as we talk about it. And the more they start to talk about it, the more then I'll say, okay, maybe this is time. I'll leave it up to them.
Excellent. It looks like that's all the questions we have in the box, but if there are others, I'm sure, Jillian, you'd be happy to respond if something comes up later,
Yes.
and we can definitely facilitate that contact.
Yeah, absolutely. My contact information is in the PowerPoint handout, and so yeah, if you have any questions or want to consult or anything like that, just feel free to email me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who attended today. And please look for that link to the recording and check out our YouTube channel for other webinars in this series. And then we also have more on opioid misuse prevention, so you'll be able to see those as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.